They're the same face! Doesn't anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
Hey, what's up, world? So a couple of videos ago, I promised everyone that I would be making a video about Moby-Dick, about the truth about Moby-Dick. Now, I've been putting this video off for a little bit now because I wasn't sure how I should go about doing this video. I sort of wanted to, get excerpts from the Moby-Dick book, maybe get some scenes from a Moby-Dick movie. I've never seen a Moby-Dick movie, but I thought, hey, maybe that might be a good idea. And then I realized that that was far too much work for me to do, and it would be much easier for me to just read from the first draft of my final paper that I had to do this semester. So this semester for one of my classes, it was a 19th century American literature class. The final paper, I did it about Moby-Dick. So what I'm going to do is, without further introduction, I'm just going to read from my first draft. This is the first draft of my final paper, so there might be some mistakes, some typos, some information that isn't fully developed, but it's all the necessary information is here. So anyway, without further ado, let me just go right ahead and read this first draft of my final paper. And actually, what I'm going to do is, I'll also be, commenting on some of the stuff I had here, so I'm not just going to be reading directly from this first draft. And of course, these lines here and stuff, this is just to block out identifying details. This is my paper. I turned it in on December 20th of 2022. So anyway, it's titled Reviving Melville's Moby-Dick. Because what I wanted to do in this paper was essentially revive what I believe was the purpose for this book, or at least Melville's purpose for writing this book, because that purpose, or that the original intention that he had, as you're going to see, was completely lost to history. But anyway, let's get right into this. So, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Ah, so you shall be sure to be misunderstood. Is it so bad, then, to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. Emerson, page 35. And of course, this is page 35 of the Emerson book that I had to read this semester. We started this semester off with Emerson. Now, what's interesting is that this quote that I started this paper off with actually came out 10 years before Melville wrote Moby-Dick. And I think it inspired some aspects, or at least it inspired some of the writing style that is found inside of Moby-Dick. But anyway, I put it here because I knew that my professor would understand why I put it here. Other people who didn't take this class might not fully understand or comprehend why I started this paper off with this quote. But anyway, let me get right into this. So, even though the first-person narrator and central character for the first 20 or so chapters of Herman Melville's Moby-Dick is Ishmael, and despite the facts that Captain Ahab isn't first mentioned until chapter 16, page 66, and is not physically introduced into the narrative until chapter 28, page 103, according to Lawrence Buell, a 2007 analysis of references in contemporary U.S. media to Moby-Dick found nearly everything in the novel seemed to be filtered out except for the epitome of Ahab's quest for the whale. Buell 384. That's just citing that quote. And modern Moby-Dick cartoons are nearly all about Ahab and the whale. I believe that modern and past pop culture references and portrayals of Moby-Dick are the result of Moby-Dick not being fully understood, and I believe that understanding the overarching theme that exists throughout Moby-Dick, which is not only introduced long before Ahab, but is practically fully developed before at least the physical introduction of Ahab, is crucial to answering questions and to countering negative perspectives that people have of the structure, the lengthy cetology digressions, as well as a number of other questionable parts of the novel. Or, as Jerome McGann puts it in his paper, Composition as Explanation of Moby-Dick, I believe, quote, the full context of Moby-Dick shows us how to read not only this story, but how to read Ishmael and the tales he has been authorized to retell. In order to demonstrate this fact, I guess I should have put these facts, in this paper I will look at why some people believe, quote, the novel's dominant presence is Ahab, not the crew, nor Ishmael, to demonstrate why this popular perspective is both wrong and keeping people from fully understanding Moby-Dick, and in order to try to figure out how and why this popular perspective came about. In Chapter 11, Moby-Dick, From Oblivion to Great American Novel, of Lawrence Buell's book The Dream of the Great American Novel, Buell attempts to reassess what it is about this vast and sprawling novel that seems so compelling after more than a century and a half, by attempting to justify, instead of understand, why popular culture's depictions of Moby-Dick are nearly all about Ahab and the whale. Buell bases his argument on 3 assertions. 1. Moby-Dick shows a keen eye for top-down perversions of institutions and societies that uphold rule of law. 2. The only purpose for the hundreds of pages that have nothing to do with Ahab is to set up, quote, a thrilling catharsis in the action-packed chase in which Ahab emerges from hundreds of pages of simmering discontent and Ishmaelian sophistry with guns blazing. And 3, that there is either A, no logic, that's a quote, no logic, in the narrative structure, or that B, the best answer that explains the narrative structure, lies more in Melville's overall career trajectory than in the logic of this one book. Because after Moby-Dick, Melville's longer fictions switches permanently from first person to third. However, I believe these assertions are erroneous, intellectually lazy, and baseless. Buell's first assertion that Moby-Dick shows a keen eye for top-down perversions of institutions can easily be proven to be erroneous by the text because even someone conducting an elementary reading of the novel will see that Ahab is not shown to pervert the whaling industry, but that the novel presents the whaling industry as an already perverted, cannibalistic institution. For example, well before Ahab is physically introduced into the novel, Ishmael says, quote, the world declines honoring us whalemen. They think that, at best, our vocation amounts to a butchering sort of business. Another way I believe Melville presents the whaling industry as an already perverted, cannibalistic, and savage institution is by emphasizing the fact that, quote, islanders seem to make the best whalemen, and the way that the whaling industry depends on cannibalistic savages like Queequeg, who is described as George Washington cannibalistically developed, Tashtego, who is described as a wild Indian, and Daggoo, who is described as a gigantic, coal-black Negro savage. However, I believe the best way that Melville presents the institution of whaling as an inherently perverse and savage institution can be found in the way that Melville humanizes whales as the novel progresses. An example of this can be seen in the Grand Armada chapter, when Ishmael creates a simile between the nursing baby whales and nursing humans, and he says, quote, and as human infants while suckling will calmly and fixedly gaze away from the breast, so did the young of the whales seem looking up towards us. By humanizing the whale, Melville turns the hunting of whales into the hunting of humanized beings, which turns the whaling institution into a metaphorically perverse, cannibalistic institution. So, in case people didn't follow me there, I'm addressing the first assertion made by Buell. And actually, I should have told everyone that this guy Lawrence Buell, who makes these assertions about Melville, that was part of a scholarly article that I was required to include into this paper. So, my professor, every text that we had to read, he also gave us like a scholarly article attached to it that was basically like analyzing the text. And he gave us this scholarly article from this guy Lawrence Buell It's chapter 11 of his book, and it's chapter 11 is called Moby-Dick, From Oblivion to Great American Novel. And Lawrence Buell basically makes these assertions that Ahab is actually the center character or the central character of Moby-Dick, and he says all of this other stuff, all of these other assertions are made by this guy Lawrence Buell, which my professor had us read, and told us that if we're going to write about Moby-Dick, we have to include Lawrence Buell's interpretation. But the problem is that Lawrence Buell's interpretation was completely wrong. So I made sure that in my paper, I addressed this fact. Not only did I address this fact, but I actually made it the central purpose of my paper. Now, what's interesting is I have another video out there that's titled How I Do College, or How College Tries to Do Me, How I Do College, whatever. And in that video, I talk about another paper that I had to write for this class. And the other paper I had to write for this class, the professor also gave us a scholarly article that misinterpreted the text. And he really didn't like that I was correcting this erroneous interpretation of the text, but he seemed to like my Moby-Dick correction. But anyway, let me continue this. I was just trying to give you guys some background and make sure that everyone's following along. Okay, yeah, I think I'm here. In order to address Buell's second assertion, that hundreds of pages of the novel are simply meant to bore the reader in order to build up Ahab's hunt of Moby-Dick, the great white whale, into this grand cathartic moment, I'd like to begin by looking at this guy's article. I honestly don't know how to pronounce his first name, but I'd like to begin by looking at Yu's article, Ishmael's Equal Eye, the Source of Balance in Moby-Dick. In his article, Yu argues that Moby-Dick is, first of all, Ishmael's cultural autobiography, and the Ahab tragedy was added onto this matrix. That Melville's originality lies in his ability to intensify Ishmael's cultural quest by the drama of Ahab, or the Pequod, which serves him as one grand lesson. And only by accepting Ishmael as narrator-hero can we dispose of such thorny issues as the cetology chapters. So there's some cetology chapters in Moby-Dick which are incredibly digressive and boring. And these cetology chapters, they're sort of a point of controversy for a lot of people. A lot of people, they kind of scratch their heads as to why Melville included or put these cetology chapters into the novel. So I'm going to be looking at them right now. So let's look at this. Essentially, Yu argues that the grand lesson Ishmael is trying to learn on his cultural quest, the lesson that he learns from both the cetology chapters and Ahab, is that, quote, the mysteries of life remaining elusive must be accepted rather than dissected. So the point here is, okay, so cetology, for people who don't know, cetology is basically like the science of whales. So the first cetology chapter occurs pretty early on in the text, and it's really lengthy, it's really digressive, it's really detailed, and it goes into all of these details about whales, all of this cetological science and stuff. And the purpose of these chapters is to show that despite all of this knowledge, despite all of this science, these scientists or this culture doesn't really understand the whale. That in order to really understand the whale, you have to experience it, but even when you experience the whale is such a magical creature that you actually can't even understand the truth about the whale from experiencing it. But anyway, I digress. Let me move on. Although I agree with you to a great degree, I believe he fails to fully take into account what Melville thought about 19th century civilization and the more cosmopolitan and critical message I believe Melville was trying to express. For now, I will simply say that what Yu argues is simply evidence that the hundreds of pages that come before Ahab's brief but action-packed skirmish with Moby-Dick do in fact have some purpose, that Ahab serves the story and the story doesn't serve Ahab. Because, that's what this guy Lawrence Buell basically tries to say. That, all of this cetology and all of this boring rhetoric or sophistry that exists before this action-packed skirmish between Ahab and the whale, that it was just meant to bore the reader to create this grand cathartic moment. And it's no, that's not at all the purpose for those previous chapters or those hundreds of pages. So, however, another argument I'd like to provide to counter this assertion of Buell's is that there is plenty of action throughout the various pages before Ahab's hunt, and even before Ahab is introduced. A small example of this can be found in the action scene that takes place between Ishmael and Queequeg upon their first coming into... yeah, that's a total typo. Upon their first coming into first contact in Chapter 3. So I guess it should be Ishmael and Queequeg upon coming into first contact in Chapter 3, the Spouter Inn. And some more obvious examples of action scenes that provide cathartic release after the Cetology, that should be Cetology chapter, can be found in the first lowering, Stubb kills a whale, the funeral, the Sphinx, the Grand Armada, and a number of other chapters. So I sort of butchered that. That's something that I had to correct in my final draft. But essentially what I'm saying here is that this idea that like all of the chapters preceding Ahab's fighting the Moby-Dick, or fighting Moby-Dick, not the Moby-Dick, but essentially what I'm saying here is that there's plenty of action before that action scene. So this idea that those hundreds of pages before that are simply meant to bore the reader is just ludicrous. It's like, but wait a second, there's actually plenty of action scenes beforehand. But anyway, to address Buell's third assertion that the narrative structure, and of course I had to expand upon this and explain, why these chapters contain action, or how these chapters contain plenty of entertaining action. To address Buell's third assertion that the narrative structure of Moby-Dick either has no logic or is the result of a transition in Melville's writing structure changing from first person to third person, I'd like to look at Jerome McGann's article, Composition as Explanation of Moby-Dick. In this article, McGann provides a very interesting argument that, quote, the structure of Moby-Dick is manifestly in debt to Byron's experiments and innovations with narrative form. That part of it is designed to make fun of the book trade's attempt to dictate how to understand an author's novel. That, quote, it is primarily Melville's rhetorical device directing readers to pay attention to how Moby-Dick is being told so that we can pay attention to ourselves and how we are reading the book. And McGann concludes that the many parodies, quote, show that a conscious artistic purpose is at work with material that are rich with inherited meanings. However, one of his most convincing pieces of evidence for the idea that Melville was intentionally parodying the book industry, presented by McGann, is the fact that Melville appeared to have gone out of his way to prevent the book industry. This is, of course, a typo here, but whatever. It's supposed to say that Melville appeared to have gone out of his way to prevent the book industry from changing the novel by taking steps to ensure that he, quote, was able both to proof and to revise his book himself without intervention or oversight by a publisher. Okay, let me just break that down a little bit. So this claim that it was just a change in Melville's style, that's why he wrote the way he wrote, or that it was like basically unintentional, is proven untrue by the lengths that Melville went to make sure that the book industry wouldn't change the way that the novel was written. So Melville clearly knew that if he gave his like a first draft of the book to the book industry, that they would have made a ton of changes to it. So what Melville did actually is he went out of his way to make sure that he was the one to proof and to revise his book himself without intervention or oversight by a publisher. And he took a number of steps to ensure that this would be the case. But anyway, I digress. Maybe I just added more confusion to that. Let me just go back to reading this. I believe Melville taking the steps he took to ensure this shows that he knew his narrative structure defied conventions, and that changing it to appease those conventions would affect the overarching theme and purpose of Moby-Dick. So, clearly I'm saying here that, Melville wrote Moby-Dick the way he wrote Moby-Dick for very important reasons. As this guy McGann said, he did it so that when people are reading it, they're paying attention to themselves as they're reading. As it says here, it is primarily Melville's rhetorical device directing readers to pay attention to how Moby Dick is being told so that we can pay attention to ourselves and how we are reading the book. And that's really what's going on. As you're going to see, as I'm going to elaborate upon, Melville wrote Moby Dick. The purpose of Moby Dick was actually to criticize the culture that would be reading Moby Dick. I'll hold off on that. Let me just continue reading. So if the popular interpretation of Moby Dick being primarily about Ahab, that Buell's three assertions attempted to rationalize, really is based on a misunderstanding of the novel. Yeah, I know, I butchered this whole paragraph. And can't be rationalized, then what is the real purpose for why Melville wrote Moby Dick, and why have so many misunderstood it for so long? So yeah, I totally butchered that, but basically what I'm saying here is that, so if this popular interpretation about Moby Dick being primarily about Ahab, if this popular interpretation is wrong, and if it's based on a misunderstanding of the novel, and, really can't be rationalized, then what is the real purpose for why Melville wrote Moby Dick, and why have so many misunderstood it for so long? So to answer this question, we have to take into context what culture was like in the 19th century and what Melville thought about it. I should have said what Melville thought about that culture. According to Philip Armstrong's article, Leviathan is a skein of networks, translations of nature and culture in Moby Dick. Before I move on to this paragraph, I have to let you all know that another parameter for this paper was that I had to include 5 other scholarly papers or 5 other scholarly articles. So that's why I have to rely a lot on this, like according to Philip and according to all these other people. I had to cite 5 other scholarly articles. And this was just fucking insane because not only did I have to read all of Moby Dick, and then the article that my professor gave me by Lawrence Buell, I then had to read 5 other articles and really comprehend those articles and figure out how to incorporate them into my paper. I mean, I had to do a shit ton of reading just for this one paper. And I had to do it all in basically a 3 weeks time, not even a 2 weeks time period. It was insane. But anyway, according to Philip Armstrong's article, Leviathan is a skein of networks, translations of nature and culture in Moby Dick, a few centuries before Melville wrote Moby Dick, 17th century political and scientific theory inaugurated a false dichotomy between the realms of nature and society, assigning humans and non-humans to separate ontological planes. And the increasingly dominant scientific demarcation between nature and society meant that any comparison between the human and the non-human fell more and more into disrepute during the 18th and 19th century. So basically what happened was a few centuries before Moby Dick was written, there was a division between the human realm and the natural realm, or the human order and the natural order, between the human kingdom and the animal kingdom. And this happened because humans, they started to advance more technologically, and they basically began to think that they were above God's creation, that, they were in charge of their own kingdom. So what ended up happening was this caused it caused humanity to look at the animal kingdom as less precious, and this is actually what led to a lot of overhunting and a lot of abuse to certain animals and a whole host of other things. But anyway, let me continue reading this. In his article, Armstrong uses these facts to argue that Moby Dick is a sort of indirect criticism or critical commentary of 19th century culture and its arrogant views about nature, humans from other cultures, science, capitalism, and even religion. And that, quote, Ahab embodies contemporary American hopes that technology would empower free men, and his quest becomes an allegory of that attempt to master nature which characterized industrial capitalism in its newfound confidence. I'm sure you all understand that. In this way, Moby Dick isn't just criticizing the book-selling industry, like McGann pointed out. He is criticizing 19th century civilized culture and all its facets, science, religion, and industrial capitalism. And this is why, like McGann states, Moby-Dick is being told so that we can pay attention to ourselves and how we are reading the book, because it is a criticism of what we would have held in the highest esteem if we were in the mid-19th century. Evidence to support Armstrong's argument that Moby-Dick is a criticism of 19th century Western culture's disconnection to nature and various 19th century institutions can be found all throughout Moby-Dick. From the very start of the book, using the sea as a representation for nature, Ishmael talks about how he needs to get to sea as soon as he can in order to drive off violent feelings and what appears like suicidal thoughts. And he appears to, and you see there's a typo here, this is incorrectly spaced, it's a first draft. Like suicidal thoughts, I have a footnote here, and this footnote is just to clarify that he indeed does have suicidal thoughts, and here's the quote attached to it. Whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, appears to be alluding to suicidal thoughts, but whatever. And he appears to demean what he calls landsmen and inlanders, while simultaneously admiring the sea, nature, by saying things like, quote, there is magic in it, and meditation and water are wedded forever. This is how he puts forever in the novel. He doesn't have forever as one word. Then, well before Captain Ahab is even mentioned in the novel, Melville further emphasizes this fact all throughout the Queequeg-Ishmael narrative. This should be hyphened. For example, in chapter 17, The Ramadan, Melville uses parody to demonstrate that despite his education, and despite being a, quote, good Presbyterian Christian, Ishmael is less civil, has less manners, demonstrates fewer civilized overtures than Queequeg when Ishmael grows vexed by Queequeg's religious practices and accuses Queequeg's religion of being, quote, really frantic. Then, much later in the novel, in chapter 110, Queequeg in his coffin, Ishmael says things like, quote, now there is this noteworthy difference between savage and civilized, that while a sick, civilized man may be 6 months convalescing, generally speaking, a sick savage is almost well again in a day. And I believe this is one point for the cetology chapter and other cetology-like digressions, to serve as a criticism of 19th century scientific knowledge, a demonstration of their futility and insufficiency, which appears to be completely confirmed later in the novel when Ishmael says things like, quote, how vain and foolish, thought I, for timid, untraveled man to try to comprehend aright this wondrous whale, by merely poring over his dead, attenuated skeleton, Melville 333. However, I think some of the best evidence for the fact that Moby-Dick is more of a critical commentary about the many facets of 19th century Western culture can be found in Homer B. Petty's article, Cannibalism, Slavery, and Self-Consumption in Moby-Dick. According to Petty, Melville distrusted hypocritical condemnations of savages or cannibals by Christian cultures, whose pieties he viewed as more gruesome than the rituals of so-called primitives. And for Melville, those who denigrate the practice of cannibal cultures do so from the standpoint of blindness to their own culture's savage heritage. And in his article, he shows how, quote, in Moby-Dick, Melville uses cannibalism in order to attack the cruel institutions which were eating away at American culture. So I just want to pause and have a little digression. So these people in like the early mid-2010s, like 2016-ish, who were putting Western culture on a pedestal, none of them at all ever looked at the negatives of Western culture. None of them looked at the fact that these Western nations, which they claimed were so civilized and cared so much about human rights, were also bombing other countries for practically no reason for decades. Like the United States bombing Vietnam, getting involved in Korea, bombing Iraq, bombing all of these other countries. All of these people, like Sargon of Akkad, he was like one of the main ones, Sargon of Akkad and Stefan Molyneux, they all praised Western culture, but none of them talked about the negatives of Western culture. And, that's sort of what this guy claims, that, these people who denigrate the practices of cannibalistic cultures or cannibal cultures do so from the standpoint of blindness to their own culture's savage heritage, and not just from a blindness of their own culture's savage heritage, not just the heritage portion, but also their own culture's modern practices, like bombing other countries for practically no reason other than their own personal gain. But anyway, let me pick up where I was at. Okay, so which we're eating away American cultures, yep. Although I've already looked at some things that confirm this, like Melville's portrayal of the whaling institution as cannibalistic, I think it is worth looking at other examples of this. Like, one great example Petty uses to demonstrate Melville distrusted popular condemnations of savages by Christian cultures that I think is worth mentioning, because it happens before Ahab is even introduced, is in the biographical chapter when Ishmael says that Queequeg was, quote, actuated by a profound desire to learn among the Christians the arts whereby to make his people still happier than they were, and more than that, still better than they were. But alas, the practices of whalemen soon convinced him that even Christians could be both miserable and wicked, infinitely more so than all his father's heathens. So there's this interesting portion in Moby-Dick where Queequeg, who's another main character in the story, and he's they call him a savage, they call him a cannibal and stuff. So there's a portion in Moby-Dick where Queequeg is all like, yeah, I actually came here to learn amongst the Christians how to make my people happier and stuff, but then I found out that actually Christians could be both miserable and wicked, and actually they could be miserable and wicked infinitely more so than all of his father's heathens. And this was Melville's way of criticizing Western Christian cultures. Anyway, let me continue on. Not only does this quote take aim at Christian culture, it takes aim at whaling, and because it does so long before Ahab is even mentioned, it really demonstrates that the theme of this book is really about Melville's criticism of 19th century culture and all its prevailing institutions, including, and probably most of all, whaling. Another great example that seems to confirm what Petty says about Melville thinking, quote, those who denigrate the practices of cannibal cultures do so from the standpoint of blindness to their own culture's savage heritage, can be found in chapter 70, The Sphinx. In this chapter, Ishmael describes the removal of a sperm whale's head, which he says, quote, is a scientific anatomical feat, and the hoisting of the sperm whale's head on the side of the ship, which Ishmael describes as hanging to, quote, the Pequod's waist like the giant Holofernes from the girdle of Judith. To fully understand how Melville is painting science, the institution of whaling, and the heritage of these cultures that denigrate whaling as cannibalistic in this brief extract, we have to recall what was said about cannibals in chapter 3, The Spouter Inn. When Ishmael first encounters Queequeg and realizes he is a cannibal, he asks the landlord of the inn why he didn't tell him, quote, that infernal harpooner was a cannibal, and the landlord, Peter Coffin, responds, I thought ye knowed it, didn't I tell ye he was peddlin' heads around town? This establishes the idea that those who are engaged in such activities should be assumed to be cannibalistic. However, the fact that Melville was pointing out the cannibalistic qualities of this activity and the heritage of the cultures that denigrate cannibalism is made all the more clear when we look at the footnote attached to the illusion of Holofernes' head hanging from the girdle of Judith. According to Herschel Parker's footnote, Judith's maid carries the head home in her bag of meat, her food bag, not hanging from Judith's belt-like girdle as pictured by some Renaissance artist. Let me just elaborate on this, do a little digression. So there's this scene, right? They cut off the head of a sperm whale and they attach it to the side of the Pequod, which is the ship, it's the whaling vessel that Ishmael is on and that Ahab is the captain of. And when they do this, they make an illusion of this giant's head that is on the side of Judith, or at least that's what is claimed. However, there's a footnote on that page, or attached to that illusion, that says that the giant's head was actually carried in a bag of meat, which is like a food bag. Where is it? Yeah, I think I'm further down. Yeah, in her food bag. And this whole thing, the purpose of this is to show that, like, this story of Judith is actually the story about a cannibal, and that, Judith actually presents cannibalistic qualities. And this is basically to show or to demonstrate that the history of these supposed Western civilized cultures is full with cannibalistic imagery and acts. But anyway, let me return back to the paper. I believe Melville chose the incorrect portrayal of the Holofernes' head on the waist to intentionally harken back to the depiction of Queequeg with human heads on his waist, but I believe that Holofernes' head being placed in a food bag further emphasizes that Melville uses this illusion to infer that this activity is cannibalistic. Clearly, Moby-Dick is a novel that has profoundly deep and critical societal themes and meaning beyond that of Ahab's revenge narrative. And because these themes are so ubiquitous and developed so long before Ahab is even introduced, clearly Ahab is not the central character and revenge is not the central theme of the novel. But if these things are so clear, then why has Moby-Dick been so misunderstood for so long? According to you, one reason Ahab stands out more is because Ishmael lacks Ahab's fanatic egotism, hence our illusion that Ahab is forcefully alive while Ishmael is not. But I think, just as in the case with Moby-Dick itself, that it is much more complicated than this. I believe one of the answers to this question lies in the experimental structure of Moby-Dick that most people can't seem to follow, which, as I said at the beginning of this paper, I think has something to do with Emerson's quote about greatness. Now, I jacked this up, so in the final paper, I actually wrote a couple of first drafts, and in one of my first drafts, I mentioned this quote, and I say something along the lines of, I believe that this quote inspired Melville to write the novel in the way that he wrote it, and that's because Melville was actually associated with a close friend of Emerson, and I go through this whole explanation. So that's why this seems totally out of place. But anyway, not relevant. Once again, first draft, you guys aren't going to be able to see my final draft, because I'm not going to let people copy my papers. I don't want somebody to see this and say, I'm going to basically copy this paper for my final paper. Not going to happen. I put way too much work into this. But anyway, Melville could have easily captured the general purpose of the novel using Ishmael and Queequeg's narrative, and he could have easily emphasized the point by having Queequeg suffer a similar tragic end as Billy Budd's in Melville's last incomplete novel, Billy Budd Sailor, and if he did, I believe nobody would have misunderstood it. Basically what I'm saying here is that Melville could have captured the purpose of the novel, the real purpose of the novel. He could have done this and made Moby-Dick much shorter by simply having Moby-Dick be very similar to his last novel, Billy Budd Sailor. Now, this is something that my professor understands, so, I was able to write it in a way that was acceptable for him. And if he did, I believe nobody would have misunderstood it. Basically, what I'm saying here is that if Melville had just made it a briefer novel and would have just made the point using Ishmael and Queequeg's narrative, then, nobody would have misunderstood the novel. But I think a great mind like Melville got carried away with his own ideas about himself being great, that he overestimated the public's ability to understand greatness, and that he wanted to write a story that wasn't telling people exactly how to understand it like every other book. I think the way that Melville prevented the book trade from altering, or maybe simplifying his narrative so that it could better suit what readers were expecting, is one way to prove this idea. However, I think that what Melville says at the end of Cetology, it's supposed to say Cetology chapter, is an even better way to prove this idea. When Melville writes, quote, "For small erections may be finished by their first architects, grand ones, true ones, ever leave the capstone to posterity. God keep me from ever completing anything. This whole book is but a drought, nay, but the drought of a drought." This is Melville basically saying, hey, you know what? This book is incomplete. For the most part, it's incomplete. but it's incomplete for a purpose, for a reason. The last reason I suspect the structure has something to do with the Emerson quote is because the quote about grayness came out roughly 10 years before Moby-Dick was published, and Melville even inscribed Moby-Dick to a close associate and fellow transcendentalist of Emerson's, Nathaniel Hawthorne. So yeah, a lot of people might not realize this, but Moby-Dick was actually inscribed, or it was like basically written to Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a really close friend and associate of Emerson's, and Emerson even let Nathaniel Hawthorne stay like 2 years on some land that he had so that Nathaniel Hawthorne could like write a book or whatever. So they're all very closely related. But anyway, let me move on. The final reason I believe Moby-Dick has been misunderstood for so long has to do with the fact that its overarching theme is a criticism of Western, Christian, American cultures that denigrate other cultures, and the fact that, according to The Politics of Early 20th Century U.S. Literary History by Cyrus R.K. Patel, before World War I, American literature had distinctly second-rate status in the eyes of most literary critics, as well as the fact that Melville's canonization was not complete until after World War II. So yeah, basically, according to this one guy, according to this The Politics of Early 20th Century U.S. Literature History, American literature wasn't even studied at the time that Moby-Dick was published. And not only was American literature not studied or critically analyzed at the time that Moby-Dick was published, but Moby-Dick didn't become popular. People didn't start really analyzing Moby-Dick until after World War II. So that means, I believe Moby-Dick was published 1851. Yeah, like 10 years before the Civil War. It was published in 1851, and people didn't really try to analyze it until the 1940s. And you're going to see why that's important right now. I believe the fact that American literature was considered second-rate by most literary critics is what led to Moby-Dick not being critically analyzed and understood, and is why, according to Patel, until 1930, Moby-Dick had been classified in the Yale University Library as a treatise on cetology. So before 1930, Moby-Dick was classified as basically like a treatise, as you see here, on cetology. It was viewed as a cetology book, and that shows how many cetology digressions exist inside of Moby-Dick. It's really, I don't want to say it's awful, but it's fucking grueling to read these cetology chapters. However, the reason Moby-Dick wasn't understood when it was being analyzed during and after World War II has everything to do with the overarching theme being a criticism of American culture at a time when, according to Patel, American literature seemed better suited to the task of strengthening the bonds of citizenship in the face of enemies abroad and disorder at home. Moby-Dick's central theme is antithetical to what the book trade was trying to use American literature for during that time. But the theme about a mad tyrant chasing an impossible dream was perfectly fitting for that time. And by that time, I mean post-World War II, after Nazi Germany and Hitler and all of that stuff. Hitler, Mussolini, and all of these other, mad tyrants. In this case, this means that despite everything Melville did to prevent the book trade from hijacking his novel, it ended up happening anyway. It just took over half a century. But hopefully papers like this one, and the one cited in it, can help turn the tide and revive Melville's original meaning for the book. But yeah, hopefully I didn't butcher this too badly. Hopefully this first draft was sufficient enough to make the idea crystal clear. But this was the real purpose of Moby-Dick. And, Moby-Dick got completely confused and it got completely misinterpreted because of the time that it was studied. Because instead of people taking into account the historical context, they were simply trying to read it from their own historical context, from their own perspective. And it's like, that's not how you read a novel. And this is why all novels usually begin with an about the author section. And that's why it's important to read the about the author section. But you know what? Hopefully this was a good video. Hopefully it shows people the truth about Moby-Dick. Hopefully it reveals a little bit about our own culture. And, hopefully it shows you guys how I do college. You know, there's a lot of people on other channels who try to demean college students and who try to say, oh, why do you go to college to get indoctrinated? I don't get indoctrinated at school, all right? I'm actually in the business of clearing up all of the bullshit. But anyway, this video is really fucking long, so I'm going to shut the hell up. I'm going to end the video here. I'll see you all in the comment section and in the next video.
Are you or are you not the Black Angel of Death?
Without question.
Don't agree with me, it just pisses me off more.